This episode is brought to you in part by Canderel. Coming soon, a luxury master-planned condominium community rising at the corner of Bathurst and St. Clair. Situated directly on the subway and streetcar line, a monument of architecture and interior design, a timeless expression of glamour and grace. Forêt Forest Hill. Register today at live@forêt.ca. That's live at FORET.ca.
This is Bonjour Chai, the Kosher Empire Strikes Back edition. I'm Avi Feingold in Montreal, and I'm here with Alana Zakon in Toronto and David Sklar in Calgary. We are your Frozen Chosen. On today's show, Kosher, the sequel. I have an in-depth discussion with Dr. Steven Lapidus about kosher in Montreal, and it is summer. Summer means tourism, and we discuss our tips for Jewish tourism in Canada. But first, Alana, David, how are you guys doing?
It's very warm out in Toronto. I hear it's raining where you are, Avi. I don't know about Calgary.
It's raining in Calgary too, which we appreciate at this time, and it avoids all the forest fires down the road.
That's a fair point. We just talk about the weather now on the show. Sorry, go.
The weather. How's the weather doing? Your weather. Yeah, I finally saw that Billy Crystal bit that you were talking about, Alana, last week.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know.
Do you speak Yiddish?
I understand a lot of Yiddish. I can probably, I speak a handful, enough phrases. Enough that when I went to see Chalm in Yiddish, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, I'm sure I
want to hear about that.
I did not need all of the super titles. I needed some of them, but I followed. And so... I can see where people thought it might be funny, and I can see where people thought it wasn't so funny. I don't know. I was trying to follow up on some of this backlash, and there were people that were like, there's a friend of mine that I know on Facebook, and he was really like not into this thing at all, and he was talking about how, he says, I'm always annoyed when somebody, especially somebody not Jewish, tells me that Yiddish is inherently funny, thinking that they are honoring me and my heritage, when in fact they are trivializing and
not
objectifying it, a version of Orientalism. Meaning somebody who's not Jewish and goes and says, Yiddish, I love Yiddish, it's such a funny language, right?
Yeah, but he is Jewish.
No. Yeah, but he started with that, and then he went and said, he goes, look, this is a guy who doesn't actually speak Yiddish, Billy Crystal. He's not coming from Yiddish culture. He's coming from Jewish culture. And he's like,
right.
I don't think it's incorrect to say that plenty of Jewish folks do this too, especially ones who grew up around Yiddish, but for whom it is the language of the other, right? Billy Crystal himself has pulled this kind of shtick before, and I never found it funny, right? And by way of comparison, if we heard someone doing this to the Chinese language or Korean or Arabic or many other languages not part of the tree that brings us to English, we wouldn't be wrong to call them bigots, right? So he's basically saying that this is like the equivalent of somebody doing 2 minutes of scat in like fake Chinese or fake Arabic and thinking that it's funny.
Ooh, he wants to cancel Billy Crystal.
No, I don't think he wants to cancel. He just said it was unfunny.
I feel like that brings us back to our conversation about like what are the lines with comedy and Jewish humor? Like, are we allowed to poke fun at things? But I guess in this context, like, it's a room full of people of all different backgrounds, but I don't know. I don't speak Yiddish, so I was completely unaware that it could be offensive to some Yiddish
It wasn't
speakers.
real Yiddish, I think, and that's where he was going there.
David, what do you think?
It was like mishkabibble Yiddish. I think as you were describing what was going on in that article, Avi, I was doing a bit of an eye roll because I was like, I think we got some more important issues that we need to talk about. And if we're complaining about Billy Crystal's, quote unquote faux Yiddish, I think we can move on from this discussion because look, I think Yiddish is a lovely, enjoyable, humorous language, right? So much of our culture, whether we know language, whether we know it a lot or not, it brings us a lot of joy. And I think I think this person who wrote the article had a lot of time on their hands to condemn and criticize Crystal's Bissel de Yiddish.
Yeah, it wasn't an article. It was a Facebook post, to be fair. It's not like this is...
So then even less value for me.
Fair enough. Okay, I think that he wasn't critiquing it. He was just sort of saying, like, this is unfunny. So moving on, we got some listener responses from last week's episode about kosher. We had Richard Rapkin on, if you guys don't remember last week. He's the managing director of the COR, and we asked him some nice pointed questions about kosher and the world of kosher and where things are going in that direction. And so we had, for example, Isabel Danino, who is a friend of mine, and she's a veterinarian, regular listener. She wrote in to say that we were right not to trust the Canadian government government regarding the treatment of cattle. Bonnie Lesh wrote in to first let us know that she enjoyed when we put Richard Rapkin on the spot. She would have loved to see an even stronger push about why keeping Shabbat, for example, is a more important criteria than sex abuser when it comes to maintaining their standards of practice. But the real purpose of this note is directed to Alana, she says. Surprised to hear you could not find kosher in Vancouver. My brother, Epi Rappaport, has operated a kosher butcher/prepared foods/deli establishment for 30 years. It's called Omnitsky Kosher on Oak Street. And so next time you are in Vancouver, check him out.
I have been to Omnitsky's. It was just really far from where I lived. My main point wasn't that it's impossible to find it. It's just really inconvenient when you live on the other side of the city.
Fair enough. And finally, we sort of related to kosher, but we got this letter that says, my partner Philip and I are classical musicians from San Francisco, and we're traveling to Montreal next week. We enjoyed listening to your Bonjour Chai podcast in advance of our trip. So thank you for listening from San Francisco, and we thought we'd reach out to try to connect. Also, suggestions for the best Jewish food in Montreal, in addition to cultural sites, would be much appreciated. Many thanks and all our best from San Francisco, Melinda Martinez-Becker. So, this got me thinking that we here at Bonjour Chai are perfectly poised to help not only her, but all other people visiting Canada this summer or other times and wanting to experience what Jewish life is like. So we're going to start today with Montreal, which is a city we are all familiar with and we all have roots in. We're going to offer our recommendations for how best to experience Jewish Montreal. But we also want you, dear listeners, to weigh in, not just from Montreal, but wherever you're from in Canada. Let's try and compile the Great Canadian Jewish Travel List, right? We'll tackle future cities in coming weeks. Let's feature your highlights then. But for now, what's on your Jewish Montreal experience list?
Okay. Well, first of all, as someone who's a huge fan of the Plateau, and I have roots there, my great-grandparents lived in that area. My grandparents grew up in that area. And on Rue St. Lawrence Boulevard, they've actually put up these different posters on the street. And some of them are on stores that have been shut down. Some of it are just on the buildings where it says like what Montreal used to look like back in the day. And it shows factories that were Jewish owned and businesses. And I think that, to me, is such an amazing way to experience like the roots of Jewish Montreal. You can also walk by all the famous delis on your way up that aren't kosher for those who keep kosher, but still very culturally Jewish, like Schwartz's, the Main. And then you make your way up to the plateau and you can see all the remnants of these old buildings. One of my favorite little secret spots is on Collège Français. You can look up on top of the building and there's actually Hebrew letters because it used to be a well-known synagogue. So I know that the Jewish Museum of Montreal, which is now moving, I believe, but they offer a tour of the area. But you can also find great resources, like walking tour resources online if you want to just do it for free yourself.
Absolutely. David, what do you guys have? What do you have?
I love that too. And I was going to mention the Montreal Jewish Museum. I actually took a tour of theirs a few years ago. I didn't know they were moving. So we need to find out where they're heading to. But there were so many spots, like you got the Bag Synagogue just around the corner.
Which is the oldest.
You got the oldest what?
Living synagogue. It's the original congregation.
Yeah. So Alana mentioned that the Collège Français, it used to be a Jewish synagogue, but also when you get out of Metro Laurier, there's another apartment building. There's an ice cream store right at the bottom. But if you look above, there are Stars of David above. And I think that used to be a synagogue as well. And it's beautiful to walk around in the plateau in Mile End and rediscover all these things. You got a lot of foods like Chesky's Bakery.
Chesky's.
Is that on Bernard? Chesky's Bakery, which is just on, I think, Bernard Street as well. So there's a lot of things to discover that, like just walking around in the plateau, the Mile End, there are a lot of Jewish roots. Walensky's, a lot of these places where Irving Layton and Mordechai Richler used to hang out. I even used to love going to Grumpy's, which is not technically a Jewish spot, but that's where Mordechai Richler would spend all the times bemoaning the state of Montreal and Quebecois society.
I gotta say, if you, it's not a Jewish bar, but if you were to name a Jewish bar something, it would be called Grumpy's.
That's where I used to hang out when I went to Concordia.
You call it Kvetchi's.
Yeah.
Let's also not forget the bagels. We're skipping a very important piece. You have to stop by the bagels and decide if you're Team St. Theodore, Team Fairmount. If you're in the Mile End, you definitely have to stop by there. Have it fresh from the oven.
So, I mean, look, I there's so much of this, and I grew up like my dad is a retired reference librarian of Jewish Montreal. He used to offer walking tours. He would we were the unwilling victims of many of his walking tours. Just Sunday afternoons, he'd make us like drive around, and he would tell us about this shul and that shul. And when you're 9, you don't really care. But I learned so much of this by osmosis, and they're all wonderful. And I really do believe that if you care about these things, take a tour. And there are many different tours that the Museum of Jewish Montreal offers, even this summer, even though they haven't yet moved, and their new building, and there's a great article about it in the CJN this recently about their new space, and it is on Saint Laurent further up the street, closer to Fairmount. So that's going to be great to check out when they open up. But a lot of that often feels very much like it's the past, right? That we're looking at older pieces of Montreal, and as a tourist, and I'm not a big tourist, and maybe we can talk about that for a bit. Like, how do you guys do your tourism when you go to other cities? I just don't go anywhere. I'm a bit of a misanthrope, and I stay in my city and I do my thing. I really prefer to see the lived experience, like what people are living like as Jews in Montreal now. I'm not going to tell people to go to the Cavendish Mall because that is extremely boring, even though that is what Jewish Montreal sort of feels like these days. But I think that, for example, saying to visit these sites is really walking around a neighborhood, which is very much lived Jewish Montreal right now. The Mile End and the Plateau is a place where a lot of Jews live, both Hasidim and non-Hasidic people. There's the Mile End Chavurah, and there's a lot of Jews that live there, and there's a lot of Hasidim. And seeing how these Hasidim interact with their Quebecois neighbors, and being around on Park and Bernard and Saint Viator, and seeing the life of these two people, to me, that is really much more Jewish Montreal. And it's just as much going to Cheskes, go and seeing the Jews and the non-Jews mingle there. If you have a chance, go to Mahadran on a Thursday night. You see how Jews eat, right? The lived experience of Jews eating Ashkenazi food, very Ashkenazi food. You get your deli roll, you get your yapchik, right? Yapchik is like this sort of kugel, but with meat in it, like a potato kugel, but with like chunks of like flanken in it. It's sort of like a pressed together, like a cholent terrine, I guess you could say.
None of that sounds appealing at all, Avi.
Oh my God, yapchik! I'm gonna give you a piece of yapchik someday. And
that sounds like you're gonna slap me across the face.
The funniest thing about Mahadran is that they don't price anything. So every time that I go in there, I'm like, how much is this? They're like, I don't know. And then they have to go to the cash, figure out the calculation.
Yeah. But Thursday nights at Mahadran, it's like a huge buffet of all the like Shabbos takeout food, and people are just sitting there and eating as if it was like, I don't know, like a buffet at a wedding or something. It's really seeing how people eat as opposed to seeing how people ate, right? I've never eaten at either of these places, but I would venture to say, based on the experience that I see of friends of mine who don't eat kosher, that you probably have a better lived experience of kosher or of Jewish Montreal by going to the Snowden Deli than by going to Schwartz's. Because 90+% of the people that are at Schwartz's are not Jewish. They're tourists. They're there to experience Schwartz's once and wait in line and do their thing. Whereas you go to the Snowden Deli, and I'm not going to pass judgment on the smoked meat at Snowden Deli. I've never eaten there. I don't know what's going on there. But I think that the seeing how Jews eat now at a real deli feels a lot more Montreal than going to see the Schwartz's, which I'm told is also an experience that you should do, but I'm really much more focused on those types of experiences. I love the idea of the Back Street Shul, but I would say go visit it on a Shabbat morning when you can actually see this really eclectic mix of Jews, right? Hasidim that don't quite fit in the Hasidic community, and hipsters that still have a traditional streak to them, and random Jews that just want to get together on a Shabbat morning and visit this really old synagogue, which is the oldest continually running synagogue in the same building, because they're older congregations, but they've moved locations. And as a matter of fact, if you go to the Back Street Shul, you visit a piece of the past Shar Shemayim, because they have the pews and the ark from the previous Shar Shemayim. When they were making their move, they sold their ark to the Back Street Shul, and you get to see a piece of history like that. So I think that seeing how Jews are living now is really interesting to go and check out. So that's my more recommendations for like that. What do you guys think along those lines? Alana, should people visit Dollard? No?
Sure.
Walk
David,
around
go first.
Hampstead, Côte St. Luc, head out to the West Island where a lot of the Jews now live. Avi, I echo your sentiments. I love your idea of sort of saying, rather than having the nostalgia of living in the past constantly, which is great. I love history. I love the history of the Jews. It's also important to recognize where are we today and where are we going in the future. And I think we should have a call out to our audience, to our listening audience. Let us know what your experiences are of the living experience of Montreal Jews today. You know, let us know. Email your thoughts.
As well as
what
your
you thought.
favorite pieces of the past, right? Your secret, pieces of the Jewish Montreal of the past.
You know what? Let us know. Join the Slack, or at the same time, even review us on Apple Podcasts to let us know your thoughts. And we want to hear from you, really, about where to go across this beautiful country.
For sure. So we want to hear about Montreal. We want to hear about your spots elsewhere. Ottawa, Halifax. What's Jewish Halifax like if you're a tourist and you want to go see what's going on there? Tell us about Vancouver, not just Omnitskis, right? But we will shout them out. But we'll explore some of these other cities in future weeks. But we want to hear from you guys. Maybe we can compile it together into a Google Doc, right? The Great Canadian Travel List, a Canadian Jewish travel list. I don't know, might be something that the Frozen Chosen can offer to the world at large as our form of like tzedakah to everybody. Your tourists, come to our great country, come check it out. Email us at bonjour@thecjn.ca. bonjour@thecjn.ca. Tell us what you care about in your town that is Jewish and that we should come and check out. So just as a last quick wrap up of Montreal, what is the one food that you have to eat in Montreal that gives you that experience? Alana.
What I would say is you have to check out the cheese bagel, which is not a bagel with cheese on it. I can't really explain it to you because I've tried to explain it to people who don't live in Montreal and they just don't get it. So I think you just need to go down to Montreal Kosher and get a fresh cheese bagel, either with sugar or without, fresh out of the oven. It is our hidden secret. Even non-Jews in Montreal don't seem to know that it exists. So to me, this is the most Montreal Jewish staple food that you can get that hasn't bleeded out into, the mainstream food culture of the city.
So I would say it like this. It's a horseshoe-shaped bagel-like looking object that has sugar on the top and is filled with a sweet cheese filling.
Is it actual cheese?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Okay.
Very dairy. Take a lactate if you can't eat dairy.
Yes. David, what's your Jewish food to hit in Montreal?
Oh, wow. I could have said I want poutine, bacon drizzled all over, but I'll avoid that for this episode as opposed to last time. So I think...
Check out a kosher poutine. Many places will offer you a kosher poutine.
Absolutely. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I'm sure that exists.
I can give some suggestions.
Go for it.
At Deli 365 in the Mile End, you can get a smoked meat poutine, which is cheeseless, but very good. Or Pizza Pita, which is the poutine that I grew up on, which to this day, I still order mozzarella cheese on poutine when I go to La Banquise and get because they have a vegetarian sauce, because I grew up on kosher poutine, and that's the way that I like it. The cheese curds just don't do it for me.
You're hurting my soul, Alana, but I will accept that. Your recommendation will become my recommendation then, right now.
All right.
So for a while, by the way, you could get kosher cheese curds that they were selling at like the kosher grocery stores.
I remember that.
And I'd be making my own poutine with like a par of gravy and kosher cheese curds. So that is something to check out. But yeah. David, what were you going to say if you weren't going to say the treif poutine from
I was going to go with an old classic Montreal kosher, a good challah warmed up in the oven, taken out for Shabbat dinner is my go-to. It makes me happy.
Egg challah or water challah?
What's water challah?
It's challah without the eggs. My kids have become obsessed with it.
I've never had that before.
Yeah, they all make it now. A lot of places, they've always made it. You can go to Cheskis, you can go to Montreal Kosher. They all make water challah. You can ask for one. It's a very different thing.
I might have to try that next time I'm in Montreal.
It's very bready. It's crusty.
What about you, Evan?
I am going to say get a shish taouk from Benny. From Benny Afis, which used to be Chez Benny, which was, Benny's moved over for like the past 25, 30 years, all in one block radius. They've moved locations, and they are now this nice, big, bright, airy place, which is different from the tiny little hole in the wall that you really felt like you were in Israel. But you can get a shish taouk and a lafa that is like so overstuffed, unless you get it from Uber Eats, in which they take 30% off of the sandwich in order to offset the cost of Uber Eats, and you get a tiny little lafa. But get a lafa from Benny & Co., Benny & Co.'s treif. And get a shish taouk if you can, which is a very Montreal-y sort of thing. It's more, everybody else would call it pargiot. But that is my go-to recommendation for like a great kosher dish that is very Montreal. That's it. Eat, enjoy, come to Montreal.
Today's episode is brought to you by our sponsor, Atelier Lou Bijouterie in Montreal, Quebec. Atelier Lou specializes in watches and custom-designed jewelry along with a curated selection of designer jewelry. Visit us online or in person and Eric Goldberg will help make your jewelry dreams come true. Atelier Lou is offering a promo code for all Montreal listeners using BON18 at checkout for 10% off your order at atelierlou.com.
Very soon after we released last week's episode, I became aware of a pamphlet and website that began to circulate around the Montreal Jewish community. The site was priceofkoshermeatmtl.com, and if you haven't seen it yet, I suggest you take a pause right now and go check it out. It's a short video and a 4-page flyer that was put out by the Montreal Vaad, the organization that is also in charge of the MK, Montreal's largest kosher supervising agency. So I'm reading this propaganda and I'm finding glaring omissions and all sorts of logical errors, right? Just to give one example, they did an informal survey of kosher meat prices to try and point out that the cost of meat was about the same in Montreal as it is in Toronto and New York. But what they fail to take into account is cost of living, right? So there are many cost of living calculators online. Looking at a fairly large crowdsourced site I just went to, livingcost.org, one can see that it is 54% less expensive to live in Montreal than in New York and 28% less expensive than living in Toronto. So, I'm not an economist or anything, but it's pretty obvious to me that to say that ground beef was comparable in price to other cities is then equivalent to saying that the cost of ground beef is 28 and 54% more expensive in Montreal than anywhere else, or than in Toronto, New York, whatever else you're going to say. Right. But the argument that struck me the most was this discussion they brought up on shchitas chutz, or external slaughter. See, right, the Montreal Vaad has upheld a ban on any meat that is not slaughtered locally. And they argue that this is actually good for the consumer and they have no control over this ban. They're just following halacha, they're following Jewish law. Luckily, I happen to know someone who has real expertise on the matter, Dr. Steven Lapidus. Steven is an old friend, a colleague, and a faculty member at Concordia University. And as it happens, he actually has researched the Montreal Vaad for his dissertation. I got on Zoom to ask him about shchitas chutz, the MK, and what to make of their defense of the price of kosher meat. Dr. Steven, welcome to Bonjour Chai.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
So, can you give us just a brief background on this term and this idea of shchitas chutz, what it means and where it came from, especially with regards to the city of Montreal?
Okay, so shchitas chutz, or basar chutz, outside meat, was an old medieval standard that existed for a variety of reasons. Essentially was to control two particular aspects of the slaughtering process. So one, to ensure that the shochet is qualified, and therefore it has to be a shochet from the local community whose qualifications can be ratified by the local rabbinate. And two, the other issue of prohibiting outside meat was to ensure that the meat was in fact soaked within 72 hours of slaughter. Sometimes the meat would be sent out and expected to be koshered in the delivery location, and that would take more than 72 hours. People wouldn't necessarily be aware of it. So to avoid those two primary reasons, basar chutz became standard in medieval European communities. It also was established in order to affirm, or assure rather, the income for the local Vaad, the local kahal, and for the local shoftim. Right, so there was involved sometimes the question of hasagas gvul, of the idea that a butcher from another town could be causing financial competition to a butcher in this town, or a shochet in this town, and therefore we don't want shochetim from other towns to come in because we don't have a large enough market to accept meat from two places or three or four, whatever it is. So there are a variety of halachic reasons for that. In Montreal, there was never a clear sense of, none of the Vaad's initial papers or letters patent or anything talk about the prohibition on basar chutz. Basar chutz became a practical problem in the 1950s and particularly in the 1960s. Initially, in the mid 1950s, Basar Chutz seemed to be accepted as a ban in Montreal.
There was never a proclamation that said, from now on, we are doing Basar Chutz. It sort of evolved into this natural thing that sort of happened.
Yes, it seems that the Vaad seemed to understand that Basar Chutz was a standard prohibition that had long been in place, but there is no official formal record of it until the 1950s and 60s. So in the mid 50s already, there's a question of bringing in frozen kosher meat. The Vaad prohibits it based on the idea of Basar Chutz, but they also mention in their minutes that the threat of installing a firm prohibition on Basar Chutz is also used as a measure to keep the butchers from importing meat. In other words, the idea that it wasn't quite confirmed at that time. In 1960, the Montreal Kosher Retail's Butchers Guild is threatening to bring in imported kosher meat from outside. Rabbis Hirschsprung, Nizhnik, and Tzvi Cohen, the chief rabbi at the time, no, I'm sorry, it's not Rabbi Tzvi Cohen, it's another Rabbi Cohen, discuss the issue. They go to New York to discuss it in front of other rabbis, and it is agreed that because we cannot control shechita that takes place outside of the city, it's agreed by Rabbi Aaron Kotler of Yosef Henkin and Rabbi Nissen Tulushkin to formally accept a ban on Basar Chutz in Montreal. That same year, Levitz begins to import meat from Rabbi Teitz in New Jersey under Rabbi Teitz's Ashgacha. The Vaad, of course, threatens to take away their supervision because they're importing meat from outside, even though, of course, nobody would doubt the kashrus of Rabbi Teitz's meat. Other butchers join Levitz in their complaint. Levitz will calls the Vaad to two Batei Din, cancels both of them before they're held, goes to civil court to sue on the issue of antitrust, of monopoly law, right? And really, I think this is the Vaad's weakest point. If it ever really were taken to civil court, you can't have a monopoly on the importation of a particular food item, right? I mean, that's simply not legal. So it never made it to court. Levitz decided in the end, they withdrew their civil case, agreed to a Beis Din, and the Beis Din was heard in New York by Rabbi J.B. Soloveitchik, Eliezer Silver, Norman Tulushkin, and they supported Basar Chutz. Finally, the next year, Drachts makes the same attempt to import meat and even to export meat from Montreal to other cities. The Vaad prohibits it. And there is again a Beis Din that makes the conclusion. I don't know who sat on the Beis Din, but it was presided by Rabbi Soloveitchik, who agrees that Montreal absolutely has the right to not permit any meat that is shechted by shochtim from outside the employ of the Vaad into Montreal.
Was there ever a time then, between then and now, when the ban was suspended, when people were actually bringing in meat? What's the situation been with this halachic situation in place on Shchitas Chutz? Where do we stand now?
Whether the ban was ever officially lifted, I don't really know. Whether the ban has been violated, obviously, and egregiously.
So what are some cases of that?
Well, for example, back in, I think, the 90s, I forget his name, there was a rabbi who originally was from Switzerland. He was at a shul a Sephardic rabbi in Côte Saint-Luc who was shechting his own lamb. One of the issues the Vaad has always faced is that it doesn't represent the Sephardi Mizrahi community sufficiently, so there's often a lack of certain cuts, such as lamb, which is, a popular Pesach time. It's typically not eaten by Ashkenazim, and Sephardim and Mizrahim do. Other issues, of course, is that many Sephardim have concerns about the kind of shechita. They want Beis Yosef shechita, which is not necessarily available in Montreal. So the Vaad has a history of not necessarily.
So we have cases where the Sephardim have violated this ban. Were there cases when the
also cases where
the MK itself, where the Vaad of Montreal has itself gone?
The MK itself has only officially or unofficially permitted the entry of poultry from out of town during a lengthy Marvid strike a few years ago, but the poultry had to be repackaged into Marvid's packages.
So wait, hold on a second. If the whole point of Shchitas Chutz is to prevent outside, if we really worried about the kosherness and of the work in the slaughter, then wouldn't, if a strike is happening, neither of those really should be viable, right? You shouldn't be able to say, well, there's a strike, so I guess we're going to start bringing in outside meat. If you say there's a strike, then there's no meat available.
I'm not a halachic expert, so I can't really, it's an interesting question that I can't answer. The Vaad did permit it was high poultry. It's poultry with a well-known hechsher, but as you say, you have a valid.
I'm just speculating. I'm not an expert either, but it sounds like to me that when it's convenient to them, they were willing to violate the ban.
Sure, you can make that argument, and of course, it was violated privately by all kinds of people who, would bring in meat to sell, within their own stores and things like that. It was also violated at a time when Mahadrins, for a short period of time, about 8 or 9 months, lost the MK. I don't think there was a moment that Mahadran's meat was not available in every single kosher butcher and butcher outlet in the city, even though it wasn't under the MK for a period of several months. It was still sold at kosher quality in other places.
Or that it wasn't even kosher, right? Nobody's doubting that even though it came from out of town, that
no,
it's not kosher.
It wasn't even, it wasn't an issue of out-of-town meat. And just
it was their own local meat that wasn't...
Lost their hechsher for 6 or 8 months for other reasons. And nevertheless, you could still find that meat in the stores. It's hard. You can't tell people, Mahadrins isn't kosher just because the Vaad said, that they violated some bylaw. So that's sort of the major issue with the violation of Basar Chutz. So the Vaad has never officially permitted it. On one occasion, at least, the Vaad was aware and allowed it to, in the case of a strike, did allow meat to be imported, but in every other situation has consistently resisted the importation of any meat, frozen, pre-prepared, or otherwise.
This will lead me to my next question, which is just questioning the role and the validity of such a ban in 2022, right? If they really believe that this is what it is, and this whole pamphlet that they brought out had this as a one of the significant parts of their argument, was that Shchitas Chutz is an important, thing to preserve within Montreal. So first of all, how many other cities in the world still have this ban of Shchitas Chutz, which is a medieval thing that exists?
As far as I know, I think Strasbourg is the only other city that has such a law.
Okay, so we're really like at the tail end of a ban which nobody else really goes and applies anymore. And if we're looking at it as we're not sure about the kosherness, right, one would assume that with the internet and with their acceptance of many, many other hashgachas for a wide variety of other products, right, they don't go and ask Kali OU and say, hey, is this product kosher? They assume that any product with an OU is able to be sold or served at an MK establishment, right? And I know that meat is more complicated, but I can't imagine that we're at the point where we can't establish strict standards that come across everything. So to be worried that this is going to be kosher or not kosher doesn't seem like a concern anymore. So on that level, Shchitas Chutz doesn't seem relevant anymore. And on the cost idea, right, it just sounds like they're protecting themselves and not necessarily the consumer.
On your first point, one does have to recognize that Montreal has not really had a major kosher scandal, which has happened in other places.
Fair enough.
One can argue the validity, the anachronism of such a situation, but the MK, at least for a very long time, I don't know exactly what the status is today, had a very strong impression internationally. It was very well accepted, and it's generally been agreed upon by a lot of people and a lot of members of the MK itself, perhaps more so than others, that the Shchitas Chutz has kept a strong control of kashrus of meat in the city. Mm-hmm. Whether or not, open cities, New York, Israel, not a city, but everything in Israel is optional, leads to a lot of difficulties. And it, in some cases, you could even argue that it leads to more corruption. In Montreal, you're eating meat that's shechted by, one of 12, 24 men that are very carefully regulated by the Vaad. There is something to be said for the standard that Shechita Chutz does establish.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, does it establish, what does it do in terms of finance?
I was going to say, I had a rabbi who always used to point out that there's no such thing as a stringency, because every stringency means that you're being lax in something else, right? That there's always a cause and effect when you're being stringent about something, right? Every chumrah has a kula attached to it, right? To use the technical term. And in this case, what I'm seeing is like, let's be really stringent on meat, but at the end result of it costing us so much more because from what I understand, there's no slaughtering that's happening in Montreal. So all of these shochtim, these slaughterers, have to be flown places to be able to slaughter the meat. All of the meat has to be transported back and forth, right? Or it has to be transported from elsewhere. And because only 12 people are slaughtering, I imagine, and I'm not a big economist, but the basic rules of economics seems to imply that means that those 12 or 24 or 30 shochtim can charge a much higher premium as a result of, and then that cost is ultimately going to get passed on to the consumer. And if you have a tight control on where the meat is coming from, that in and of itself, right, by not opening it up to competition, is also allowing, right, prices to artificially rise. And I'm not talking about comparing it to Toronto, comparing it to whatever, because the cost of living in Montreal versus Toronto versus New York is very, very different. But in and of itself, Montreal seems to me that the issue is not comparing it to other cities, but comparing it to itself and saying that if we had more competition, the prices would drop significantly. And Shechita Chutz is one of those things that actually, as you pointed out, prevents competition, enforces a monopoly, and means that people can charge whatever they want.
Absolutely. There is no competition in kashrus in Montreal in terms of meat. In fact, most of the kosher beef manufacturers are all owned by the same company.
So Mahadran and Continental and other brands are basically owned by one company, and it's just repackaged marketing and branding. Right.
Separate sites and things like that, but one common owner. I think it's just Mahadran and Continental today. Glotz is gone.
Okay.
Except Glotz, there might be a wholesale Glotz that doesn't come to the customer, but is doing that certainly is an issue. That competition within the market is eliminated when you. Right. All shochtim are hired by the same organization.
When I was looking at the price thing that they had put out to show that the price of meat is not that different, I'm seeing the price of ground beef in Montreal versus Toronto versus New York, New Jersey, and they're not actually pointing out the price of non-kosher equivalent meats in the various cities and what the price differential is. Right. And that to me is a more accurate goal. And I would imagine that if one does the research, that we would find a much bigger discrepancy in price between non-kosher meat and kosher meat in Montreal versus Toronto and or New York, New Jersey, because there's competition. Or maybe you're not, you have done the research, so maybe help me out.
I'm still not sure of that. I think you have a better point in the issue of cost of living. The cost of living in Montreal in general is that much cheaper than New York. So therefore, kosher meat should be that much cheaper. The idea that kosher meat costs the same as it does in New York, as a much higher cost of living, can imply inflation.
Artificially inflated prices in Montreal is what I'm saying. Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Excellent. What would, just to wrap things up, right? What would you think a robust and healthy kosher meat market, right? Financial market, economic market would look like in a city, as opposed to what we have in Montreal, where it's all being regulated by one kosher agency with a very small number of shochtim and slaughterers and a very small number of meat producers. Again, you're not an economist, but you have done a lot of this research. And I imagine 100 years ago, the scene in Montreal was very different. And
I'd rather answer my own question. That's kind of like yours, and that is, what is problematic about the Vaad? I think what's problematic about the situation is...
I have no problem saying that, but I was trying to be nice. And if you're going to ask what's problematic, you want to answer that, please.
It's not what's problematic about the idea of Shechita Chutz. The problem with the idea of Shechita Chutz is that it comes under, as you've been implying, this presumption of unity in the community. And Jewish communities are not united in that way anymore. Much of the Hasidic community does not rely on the MK. And if the shochet were not a Belzer, they would not eat this meat. And, we know that many
Are they
people
bringing
in
in
the
meat
Hasidic community are
outside
importing
of?
from New York. Yes, of course.
And why does the MK say anything about that?
Probably because at the same time, the Hasidic community, when they do engage with the MK, is among the biggest supporters, biggest consumers. But there exists in Montreal SK, Satmar Kosher, Rav Lerner of Belz has his own hashgacha on certain things, and Tosh has their own hashgacha. So to me, the issue is, I don't know the answer of what would be a better, kashrus setup. What I see is a kashrus setup that is not responding to the needs of the individuals. Other issues, for example, the Vaad standards on, checking fruits and vegetables for bugs are the exact same as the CRC, the Hisachtos from Williamsburg. That's not the standard.
Yeah.
Right. This is, this is not,
as we said, with every stringency comes a leniency. And so you can be really stringent, but you're doing it on the backs of people who are way less able to pay for food and are being forced to buy food that is being a much bigger percentage of which is going towards the certification and not towards the food itself.
Right. And, the other problem, of course, and this, this is not the Vaad necessarily, not the Vaad uniquely, but one of the problems with contemporary kashrus is it's very much tied to economic social mobility, right? It's buy the bodek bug-free cabbage or broccoli for 2 or 3 times the price of a regular broccoli. That's not fair or egalitarian for the whole community. And that's, where things are going in general. Don't eat broccoli or get the pre-checked one. So they're definitely, in that sense, the Vaad and in general, right-wing orthodoxy is not responding to the financial burdens
of the larger population that may not be Orthodox but is buying kosher products, or may not be right-wing Orthodox
and does not adhere to these standards, right? The fact that there's no non-glot meat produced in the world, right? If it's not glot, if the lung has a problem, they immediately sell the carcass to the non-kosher side.
But there's a lot of people for whom non-glot meat, but would be very kosher, would be very fine.
It would be half the price or 2/3 the price. Of course, these, so you have shchutei chutz, along with, a particular standard of kashrus that does not necessarily, and then of course, as I mentioned earlier, you have many, many Orthodox Sephardi people complaining that they're not getting, the kashrus standards that they require, which are slightly different from the kashrus standards of the Ashkenazi majority.
Fascinating. Okay, well, I'm glad that we clarified this for a lot of people in a more open-minded way, or a more both sides sort of way, looking at this idea of shchitas chutz. I think it's fair to say that there are significant problems that come along with shchitas chutz that the MK is not talking about. There are a lot of financial burdens that do come with shchitas chutz. There's a lot of other issues, and for every stringency that we have, we are looking at leniencies and not being as nearly as careful about people's finances. And this day and age, it really means a big deal. So if you're looking at where the price of kosher meat is, it actually has a lot to do with what shchitas chutz is about, and related to that. And hopefully, we can move towards a more progressive and more open marketplace here in Montreal.
In defense of shchitas chutz, I mentioned it before.
For sure.
In defense of shchitas chutz, it was a policy substantiated by some of the most prominent and respected rabbis in North America. The Vaad,
and how many decades ago?
Decades ago, absolutely.
Many decades ago, and to the point where
support from Rabbi Soloveitchik, Ron Kotler, and Rav Moshe Feinstein.
Sure, but it's also something that many cities had before, and by now we're one of the last ones.
All of whom are dead for decades already. So your point is well taken. These are not contemporary Piskei Halacha.
I think if the Vaad really cared about the finances of people, they would be asking, would you be willing to have maybe 2 sets of things, where we have we have a certain really stringent brand, and then we have a non-glot or a glot brand that is a lot more basic, and even if that's not even opening it up to competition, and then opening it up to competition while still maintaining that MK will only use, slaughtering within Montreal, or with Montreal Shoftim following this shchitas chutz ban, would even further help the thing and let the consumer decide and say, right, we have kosher meat here, we have none. If you want to have the Shtetas Chutz abiding meat, you can buy it from this butcher who's agreeing to it, but everybody else is free to go and buy everything else. But from what I understand, there have been a lot of tactics that have been used to people that have been trying to bring in even sealed packaged kosher meat with other hashgachas into Montreal. So, there's definitely room for improvement for where we're moving with that. All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Lapidus. And hopefully we will, if there's anything else that we can talk about kosher in Montreal, we'd love to have you back on.
Thank you very much.
Shkoyach. You can find a link to the MK site in the show notes, and you can email us at bonjour@thecjn.ca to let us know what you thought. So now for our word of wisdom this week. This week is Parashat Shalach, right, which tells the story of the spies as they enter into Israel. And this is the moment when they were supposed to go right into Israel, and the entire people of Israel get punished for the sin of the spies, and they end up having to wander the desert for 40 years as their penance, right? So to compare what was happening with the spies, I had somebody on Twitter that pointed out, he goes, so imagine you send spies to other sections of shul and you find out that their kiddush is better than yours. Right? That's what happened with the spies, right? And then you complain, of course, I want a better kiddush. They have smoked meat and we have saltine crackers, and that's it. So what it got me thinking about in terms of the spies is that they were not able to appreciate what they actually had. And that's really one of the recurring themes of the Israelites in the desert, is that they're always complaining. And I really wanted to just take a moment and reflect on gratitude, right? And being grateful for what we actually have as opposed to what we wish we had or what was in the past or what we think could be better in the future, as opposed to enjoying and appreciating what we have and what is for now. David, Alana, do you guys have any thoughts on gratitude? Like where do you live your gratitude moments, and how do you make sure that you guys are grounded in terms of gratitude?
I've gone through periods where everything felt really overwhelming, and I tried to do that thing where you think of 3 things that you're grateful for right before you go to bed. I found that for a short period of time of a few months, I found that really helpful, because sometimes you don't actually stop to think about what you have that you're taking for granted. I mean, these days for me, I journal every single morning, and that's a way to just kind of check in with myself and get everything out of my head onto the page. And I think that keeps me very grounded. How about you, David?
Great question. I think when I'm on social media a lot, it's very easy to feel that your life is not where it should be. Everyone is succeeding and doing it better and quicker than you, right? Everyone is booking this amazing gig. They're flying off to Europe right now. I'm stuck here. What is not going well, right? I think it's very easy for me to get sort of sucked into this vortex at times. But what I do, I work as a recreational therapy aid worker, right? I work with senior citizens a lot. And I think where I find my gratitude is being with them, sharing moments with them. And I think there's an element where some of these senior citizens don't have family ever come, right? They are alone. They don't have anyone showing up for them. And I think I look back to mine, and I have a very supportive network here, a family, of my partner's family. We're together a lot. We share a lot of time together, meals. And I think it's to recognize that is what helps ground me, is this moment of being together and supporting each other. That's where I find it.
I think that what you guys are saying is really important, and being able to stop and take a moment and being aware is at the essence and at the core of all that. When I started doing that, I started journaling in the mornings or at night. And my wife has a practice. She likes to talk about doing gratitude journaling specifically, and doing 30 days in a row. And if you miss a day, you got to start all over again until you get to 30 days of being able to notice something that is grateful for you. It's hard, because I would say, like, today I'm grateful for, and I kept saying the same stuff over and over again. And what flipped the switch for me is realizing that sometimes in prayer, we often have these moments when we're asked to think about what we're grateful for, and it gives us that moment to reflect. And so I would find that every morning now when I daven, when I do my morning prayers, whether in services at synagogue or at home, I have this moment to stop and reflect and to ask myself, what am I being grateful for, so that when I write in my morning journal or my evening, prep for the next day, and to say, today I am grateful for X, it was something different and something specific. And it really being able to open up your eyes as opposed to that hyper focus of like what's immediately in front of you, looking at our peripheral vision, right? So for me, that specifically was being able to use prayer and using those moments of mindfulness during tefillah, during morning prayers, to open up my field of vision to all the periphery and to where I'm not finding the things that I'm grateful for and I should be more grateful for. So 100% all of that stuff. And I think that, like I said, this parsha, this week's Torah portion, is very much an exhortation for us to go and say, remember that don't look at what's better on the other kiddush, right, or in the other country. Look at what you have and what's amazing for where
all
you
these
are
great branding
Enjoy your
ideas.
own saltines. Don't worry about the brisket at the other table.
100%. Now put that on a T-shirt and or in a journal front. Live, laugh, love. Enjoy your saltines, not the other person's brisket. Absolutely. We're at the point in our show where we like to talk about our nachas of the week, that thing that made us feel good over the past week. David, what's your nachas?
I'm going to give my nachas to Marnie Bondar and Dalia Libin. Together they organized a photography exhibition called Here to Tell, Faces of Holocaust Survivors. It's currently open at the Glenbow Museum. There's about 122 images of Holocaust survivors, 39 who are currently living, and they all have connections to the city of Calgary. And they did an article with Bondar, and I like what she said. So here's her quote. She says, "There's been lots shared about the Holocaust, but not so much about their life after the Holocaust. We wanted to share stories about resistance, resilience, thriving after hope. That really is our legacy."
Beautiful. Alana, what's your nachas?
Very different tone. I wanted to shout out a funny tweet that came out yesterday by Manischewitz that said, "You asked, we listened.
Oh my God.
The R&D team
Oh my
hasn't
God,
slept all
yes.
week, and now the factory will be cranking out these babies 24/6 just in time for July 4th, an American tradition your bubby will love. Hashtag gefilte dogs. Hashtag gefilte beef." And then there's a picture of gefilte dogs made with real gefilte fish, Bubby's recipe. I don't think this is real, though people are reacting to it as if it is. Do you know, either of you?
I have not heard anything about this.
Yeah, so I heard about this. It almost certainly feels not true, although if they made it true, it would be absolutely awesome. What I have been loving is following all the responses on Twitter to this, right? It's like, 'cause I think it started because like somebody was like, oh, hot dogs, gefilte, right? It's basically the same thing, right?
It's the same thing. I saw those memes.
So it's like, we're going to set the record straight here. Hot dogs are nothing like gefilte fish. Gefilte fish is made from the highest quality, freshest fish. Hot dogs, who knows? That's Manischewitz, right? And then like, you have these people who are like responding like, who asked for this? I want names, right? And Manischewitz responds like, Chani, Shmuel, Ronnie, Talia, Tom, Mike, Shani, Harold, Sarah, Evelyn, Esty. You want the rest of the list? Right. Right. And then ain't going to work on Saturday. It's Shabbos Kodesh, right? They shout out Big Gedalia Goomber, which is like an Uncle Moishi thing, which is really funny. I love the stadium size that they put out there. Somebody responded. And then I love this, right? So unfortunately, my matzah bun keeps breaking in half. Right. To which then somebody else responds, the trick is to dampen the matzah, roll it around the dog, and then fry it in a pan. Otherwise, the matzah rolls, right? It's a ton of eggs plus matzah meal, and they are surprisingly edible. Can't wait till next Pesach, right? This is just like, it's brilliant, right? And then somebody goes, hot dogs.
That's good.
Right. As a response. Right. Dog is fish in Hebrew. Really, really funny. Oh my God, just like go and check the Twitter responses for this, because that to me is the most brilliant part of this. So yes, thank you, Alana. Greatest nachas of the year so far, maybe, or something like that. Yeah. My nachas, I have other nachases, but they pale in comparison, and I would absolutely be remiss if I didn't finally shout out one last time. I finally got to see the actual performance of my wife and my daughter in Chelm. right? The Sages of Chelm at the Siegel Center. It is still playing. If you haven't yet seen it, and you hear this tonight, it is still playing tonight, Thursday night. It is playing Sunday for 2 performances. Go check it out. It is incredibly funny. There is slapstick, there is pathos, there is a love story, there is singing. It is great. They did a great job updating it for the modern age with great bits. They put in a gay character. They have a character with an iPad walking around now. It just feels so modern and yet still very traditional. It's all in Yiddish. There are super titles which help with you can understand what's going on, but the physical comedy and the music is great. The characters are great, of course. Rachel's performance is unbelievable. My daughter's performance was great to see that, like, she has it in her, that she's a great actor. So absolutely, Chelm is by far my big nachas of the week, and anything else pales in comparison. The Sages of Chelm at the Siegel Center.
Chelm.
Everything else pales except for gefilte dogs.
Except for gefilte dogs.
Let's just put that out
there.
there.
The best thing you can possibly do this week is go see Chelm while eating a gefilte dog in a matzah bun.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to Bonjour Chai for the week of June 24th, Shabbat Parashat Shalach. Our producer is Michael Freeman. Technical production is by Andre Goulet. Our music is by So Called. We are a project of the Jewish Living Lab and are distributed by the CJN Podcast Network. You can listen to all our past episodes on our page at thecjn.ca/bonjour, and you can subscribe to the podcast and automatically receive all episodes on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like us, do us a favor, really, and tell a friend about this podcast. Get them to subscribe as well. It helps us almost as much as leaving us a comment and a rating, which you should also do. And of course, as always, you can email us with comments at bonjour@thecjn.ca. I'm Avi Feingold.
I'm Ilana Zakon.
And I'm David Sklar.